Order. Order. Clive Lewis to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Davies. It's an honour to conduct this debate with you as Chair. And I beg to move that this House has considered the motion that the government role in promoting financial security and reducing inequality in the Caribbean. Mr Davies, before we embark upon such debates, it is customary for members to declare any interests which may influence them in the debate at hand. Heritage is rarely one of them, but I would, for the purposes of this debate, like to declare that I am the son of both Britain and the Caribbean island of Grenada, and therefore have a vested interest on these matters. And what are these matters, Mr Davies? Well, I would contend that you cannot debate our government's role in promoting financial security and reducing inequality in the Caribbean without discussing the elephant in the room, namely the preceding 400 years of exploitative colonial history and the urgent need for some form of reparatory justice. Of course, I'm not the first person to raise this issue. Indeed, I wouldn't be here discussing this matter today without the understanding and analysis of Caribbean giants like Frantz Fanon, who wrote the book Wretched of the Earth, Eric Williams' seminal work on capitalism and slavery, Walter Rodney on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and Sir Hilary Beckles, how Britain underdeveloped the Caribbean. But whilst they, in their own way, gave us the theoretical and academic arguments for the case for reparations, for colonialism and slavery, I'd also like to thank another group for the compassion and leadership they've shown on this issue, namely the Trevelyan family, some of whom I believe are here today in the gallery, fresh from their visit to Grenada, where, as the descendants of slave owners in Grenada, they did what no British government has ever done before. They apologised for their ancestors' part in the exploitation of the 1,000 slaves they owned on 6 plantations. They acknowledged the financial and cultural advantage this had generated for them and urged the British government, as I will today, to enter into meaningful negotiations with the governments of the Caribbean in order to make appropriate reparations. But they didn't leave it there, Mr Davies. They also set up an educational fund worth £100,000 and in so doing opened the door of this debate just a little wider. So thank you very much for all that you have done. Mr Davies, the issue of reparations could simply be dismissed as the obsession of a small group of so-called woke extremists. We've seen in this country a political backlash, often from members on the benches opposite, against any notion we should reassess our own history as regards colonialism and slavery and the impact it has had and continues to have on the lives of millions across the globe and here in the UK. Whether the putting down of slaver statues or campaigning against the National Trust's efforts to educate the public about the links between slavery and the financing behind many of our stately homes, this is a live issue that evokes great passion and sometimes anger. And that's entirely understandable, because when anyone questions the very story we tell ourselves and the world around us about who we are and what we represent, it's challenging, triggering even. If you've been in a relationship, you'll know this. The reason relationships can be so difficult is because our partners often challenge those notions of who we think we are. What do you mean, I snore? What do you mean, I'm tight-fisted? How dare you say, I leave the toilet seat up? Learning things about ourselves from others can either end in denial, argument, and divorce, or it can result in growth and development. That's what those calling for dialogue on this issue are striving for, because the Commonwealth is a relationship between Britain and her former colonies, and like a partner that has endured 400 years of the most hideous abuse, one who now seeks not charity, but restitution. I will give way.
thank my honourable friend for giving way and for securing this important debate. He's making an impassioned speech. Does he agree that the case for former colonial powers to pay reparations to the descendants of enslaved people is particularly strong, given that the UK government was making compensation payments to the descendants of enslavers, families and organisations as recently as 2015? And the reason why reparations are the right and fair thing to do is, yes, because of the legacy of slavery and because the wealth that countries like ours extracted underdeveloped those societies, but also because of our role in the climate crisis and the fact that that threatens the very future of the Caribbean.
Lewis.
I thank my honourable friend for her points, and they are points that I will come on to in this speech. I think one of the key things you've pulled out there is that successive governments have made many arguments about why this shouldn't happen, when actually they should be making the argument about why it should be happening. And I wanted to pick up on one of the things, I won't have time in my speech, one of the arguments that is often made by governments over the last 20, 30 years in the post-colonial period about why we shouldn't be paying reparations for the slave trade and colonialism. And the argument is because it was legal at the time. That's not just an argument that this government makes, it's one that our own government in the noughties, the Labour government, made as well. And I will. If I could just finish the point, and then I will allow the honourable member to intervene. But you have to remember that throughout history, in the 20th century, we know that countries brutally treated and exterminated people, ostensibly under the laws of those countries. So I think we need to be really clear that we cannot allow that argument as an argument to be made against reparations. I give way to the honourable member.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I speak as the chairman of the all-party group for St Kitts and Nevis in this debate. But could I just say to him, I think all members of this House will be incentivised and motivated to ensure that there is the greatest flow of capital to our allies in the Caribbean. But would he not agree with me that more importantly than reparations is giving the Caribbean states tariff-free access to the United Kingdom, the world's 5th largest economy, rather than the protectionist racket that they have experienced from the European Union, which inherently tried to restrict the flow of goods from the Caribbean to the European Union?
I thank the honourable member for making that point. Firstly, you will not find me defending the EU on the matter of the Caribbean. I will come on later to explain why the EU also owes a debt to the Caribbean, not just the United Kingdom. But the first thing I will say is that, as you will hear in my arguments, if you look at how the Caribbean has been systematically underdeveloped, to then say, well, let's not worry too much about the past, you can now take advantage of tariff-free access to UK markets. But if you haven't got an economy to take advantage of those tariffs, then I would argue, what is the point? First of all, we have to build up the economies in the Caribbean. We have to structurally invest in their people, in the infrastructure of those countries to enable them to be able to make use of that tariff-free access before anything can happen. I give way to the honourable member.
I thank you, Chair. I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's making an extremely powerful speech today. And we often hear that argument, you know, let's forget what happened. Reparations is about making amends for centuries of violence and discrimination against a country. And it's really interesting why people say let's forget what's happened when countries, as you say, are still in debt, where their jewels and artifacts are in our museums in this country. They refuse to give them back. There's a lot of reparation that needs to be done, whether it be reparations, economics, or an acknowledgement. And it is time that our country acknowledge. Will my honourable friend agree with me that any arguments against this is not only a betrayal, but it's also a collusion in what happened many centuries ago?
Clive Lewis.
I thank my honourable friend for her wonderful intervention. It's almost as if you're reading ahead in my speech, and I will come on to some of these points. But clearly, I would go further and say that this country will not be able to move on as a cohesive whole until these issues are resolved. And I think that's something that everyone in this room would want to see happen as this country goes forward post-Brexit into the big wide world yonder. And I will come on to some of these issues later on in my speech. So I was in the middle of my discussion about being in a relationship and about the Commonwealth being a relationship between Britain and her former colonies. And like a partner that has endured 400 years of the most hideous abuse, one who now seeks not charity, but restitution. The alternative is divorce in the form of growing Republican sentiment across the Caribbean. Because abusive partners who cannot say sorry, cannot change, can never grow, can never develop, and who in their right mind would want to stay in an abusive relationship like that? But don't take my word for that. King Charles III has, through his goddaughter Fiona Compton, shown an intimate understanding of the necessity for this national conversation. Knowing as he does that he could well be the last king of anything resembling an international commonwealth. And as such, the monarch has shifted position. He believes, we are told, that British history shouldn't be hidden, and that in the same way we are taught about the Holocaust, we should be open about speaking about Britain's involvement in the slave trade. For it seems this country still finds it easier to remember the transgressions of other nations than it does its own. So, Mr. Davies, let me turn to the issue of those transgressions themselves. What happened that Britain or any other European colonial power should be expected to apologise and pay reparations? As any student of history would attest, it is littered with ancient atrocities and what would now be called crimes against humanity that elicit no such reaction or demand. What makes what took place in the Caribbean so different? I think Sir Hilary Beckles, historian and Vice-Chancellor of the University of West Indies, nails a key part of this argument, why, in his book. And the book was called How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean. And he states that the modern Caribbean economy was invented, structured and managed by European states for one purpose: to achieve maximum wealth extraction to fuel and sustain their national financial, commercial and industrial transformation. Therefore, for each European state, the Caribbean economy was primarily an external economic engine propelling and promoting national economic growth. No other large and lucrative colonized economy in the 500-year history of Western economic development has ever been created for such a singular purpose. No such economy has ever been as intensively exploited as that of the Caribbean by imperial entrepreneurs and national states. Europe, Britain, chief among them, called into being a new, immoral, entrepreneurial order that defined the Caribbean economy as a frontier beyond accountability of civilization, where crimes against humanity became a cultural norm, with the ability to accumulate wealth without cultural or ethical constraints, institutionalizing piracy and plunder, genocide and slavery, violent hostility and hatred, and notions of black subhumanity. These were the driving forces in Europe's wealth extraction as it rose to economic dominance. A dominance, we know, it still enjoys to this very day. So Hilary goes on to describe slavery as systematic genocide, because whilst around 3.5 million Africans were brought to the Caribbean in those 400 years, only 600,000 were in the region by the time of emancipation. Unsurprising, given the average youthful lifespan of a West Indian slave was 5 to 10 years. And that went on for 400 years. So extreme was their treatment. British history books might tell us that the first African slaves landed in the British Empire in 1624. But when you listen to that, the reality is black people, Africans, didn't land in the British Empire. The British Empire landed on them. That's what happened in 1624 and continued to happen for 400 years and is still happening to this very day. But it's not just Africans. Indians as well were forcibly indentured in the Caribbean by the British. And let's not forget the 3 million indigenous peoples estimated to inhabit the Caribbean in 1700. I myself have some Caribbean in me. I can trace it back through my great-grandmother. They were deliberately wiped out by those European forces so that now only 30,000 survive. As the fabulous research of the University of College London shows, even the abolition of slavery in the 1830s would see no justice. For it was the slavers and not the slaves themselves who received the vast sums of compensation, billions in today's money, that the taxpayers in the UK, including the Caribbeans who came here in the post-war period to rebuild this country, after it finished fighting a war ostensibly against racism and fascism, finished paying off in 2015, so vast was the debt. Just think about that. The people who for 400 years have been brutalised and exploited came back to the mother country after this country had fought a war against racism to rebuild this country, leaving their country in poverty, to rebuild this country and pay taxes to pay their former slave masters. But it doesn't end there. It doesn't end there. Because those same people were then, decades later, after working for this country, some of them were deported as illegal immigrants in the Windrush scandal. You can't make this up. You could write a book and someone would say this was a fiction. And it gets worse, because we know that the Windrush compensation scheme was put in place, made so difficult to apply for, that less than 1 in 4 people eligible for that compensation have been able to receive it. This isn't a scandal, it goes beyond scandal. I will give way to the member.
He's making a very impassioned speech, but he's talking about immigration and the rights of people. Can I just say to him, as the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament, who has come to this country from Poland, one of the reasons I campaigned for Brexit is because I felt that the current immigration policy was racist. We gave automatic access to fellow white Europeans to the exclusion of Commonwealth citizens. I want everybody to be treated in the same way when they are at our border, irrespective of their colour, religion, or where they're from. It should be based on their skill sets. And that's why I think the Labour Party and the SNP, I hear chuntering from the SNP, campaigned for a system which would have allowed this ongoing racism to take place. Automatic access for Europeans to the exclusion of Commonwealth citizens.
I thank the honourable member for making those points. And I think we can have both a fair immigration system in this country, which we don't have at the moment, and we can also have justice for the Caribbean. The two are not controversial, and they're not incompatible. So we know that this money, from the money paid to the slave owners in the 1830s, we know this money poured into the British economy, paying for Victorian infrastructure and modernisation. The embankment, which is just over there, which we now sit across from. The first underground, the Metropolitan line, new modern insurance companies with the capital to go global. All of this was generated by that investment that came from the compensation given to the slave owners. Indeed, we know slave owner compensation in part funded what would eventually become the insurance giant Aviva, based in my own constituency of Norwich South and formerly known as Norwich Union. It financed vast cultural and learning investment in universities, the creative arts and science. And of course, it financed a modern 19th century military-industrial machine, one finally able to colonize Africa and vast swathes of Asia in the fast phase of 19th century colonialism, finishing off what had been started in the centuries before. For former slaves in the Caribbean, there was no such economic renaissance. The century after emancipation was one of racist brutality, the suppression of basic human and labour rights, bloodshed and massacre. Even by the 1930s, Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and St. Kitts were witnessing violent suppression and death at the hands of British colonial police forces for seeking basic labour rights in the colonial sugar factories, mines and fields they still toiled in for poverty wages. And all the time, those profits rolled out of the Caribbean and not into them. But Mr. Davies, already now I can hear the howls of those opposed to reparations and apology, which no British government has ever given. Move on! Get over it! Don't linger in the past! Look to the future! But Mr. Davies, there is no future worth looking forward to in the Caribbean until we confront the past. Go to the Caribbean and what you will see is the past alive and well today. Poverty, racism still, inequality and debt. But don't confuse an honest appraisal of the situation across much of today's Caribbean for victimhood. Because whilst the peoples of the Caribbean have been wronged, they are a proud and capable people whose 400-year baptism of fire has made them strong and resilient with great potential. Potential that now needs to be realised. Take, for example, the University of the West Indies. Despite the past, it rates amongst the top 1.5% of universities globally. Evidence of how far ahead the Caribbean could have been had 3/4 of the population not been unable to read or write just 60 years ago. That was the condition they were left in when they were given independence. Illiteracy rates of 60 or 70%. So, when as happened this week, the Prime Minister of Grenada, Dickon Mitchell, invites British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, another son of empire, to discuss reparations, he does so with the full understanding of that potential. Potential that CARICOM and its 10-point plan for reparatory justice also recognises. Its reparation committee, working with organisations like Repair, set up by the entrepreneur Dennis O'Brien, their joint mission for an EU and UK 25-year multi-billion-pound programme of reparation and repair and investment into the Caribbean. Education, physical infrastructure, science and technology, replicating the EU's structural investment funding that transformed the poorest countries and regions of the EU, including Ireland and Poland. The same can be done for the Caribbean, giving them the tools to prosper, to make the jump to clean energy technologies, to adapt to the climate crisis it will be disproportionately affected by. After centuries of carbon-intensive manufacturing that the bodies of its people financed in the first place but received no share in its bounty. The irony of the climate crisis is never missed upon me and millions of other people around the planet. Now, I'm sure the Minister will tell us today of the largesse of Britain and its generous overseas development packages. Well, let's look at that. Let's unpack it. Let's even forget for now that this government oversaw a 21% drop in aid spending compared to 2020 as a result of its decision to cut aid budgets from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% of GDP. So let's forget that. Let's look at the Caribbean. I've got here the House of Commons Library figures for the British government's overseas aid to Caribbean countries, not adjusted for inflation, in millions. Grenada. See. My eyes. Sorry, Chair. See. 0.0. 0.0. This is years. 0.0. 0.0. 0.0. 0.0. 0.0. 0.0. Oh, 0.1. 0.2. This is the reality of overseas aid for the Caribbean. Let's go down. St. Lucia, 0.0, 0.0, 0.2, 0.2, 0.1, The 0.2 is a fraction of millions. This is hundreds of thousands of pounds. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 0.0, 0.0, 0.0, 0.0, 0.0, 0.0, 0.1. You get the picture.
Give way.
I will give way.
Again, my honourable friend is making such a powerful speech. Does he agree with me that it's also true that development aid is often given through a middleman to developing countries and not directly to the countries themselves or small businesses within those countries that are doing valuable work? And it's often difficult to find who these middlemen are, but we know how middlemen worked during COVID.
Clive Lewis.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. We do know how those middlemen worked during COVID, and they certainly took their cut, and they continue to take their cut. We want something completely different. We want to give the victims of slavery and of colonialism the tools and ability to help themselves. They don't want to hand up. They want to hand out. They want to hand up, and they want to be able to build for themselves. Mr. Davies, there must be a reckoning with the primary reason that empire was created in the first place: to materially enrich some people at the expense of others. Its afterlife isn't an issue of identity politics, but a key contributor to global inequality and its corrosive impact upon democracy. But I want to conclude on a personal note. The BBC's Laura Trevelyan, who made such a moving BBC documentary about her journey of discovery about her ancestors' part in this story, shared with me the comments of a Caribbean woman who worked in the NHS. And after watching her programme, she told her how this lack of justice, combined with the Windrush scandal, meant for the first time in her life, she felt that she didn't belong to this country, didn't belong in it despite being born here and working here all her life. And I know that her and many other black people in this country will be able to relate to that. It's one that I can relate to, Chair. And I think we as a country and as a parliament have to remember that until we as a country acknowledge the past and play our part in resolving and helping to build a better future, we as a country will never be able to heal, will never be able to move forward, and a significant part of the people of this country will never truly feel a part of this country. And if we live up to the words that we often talk about in this place, about how we want to take our country forward into the future, a bright future, together collectively, then that cannot be allowed to happen. And this issue of reparatory justice must be confronted now, because I know that if this government doesn't do it, the next government, whoever they may be, will find these arguments growing stronger by the year, by the day, by the week. Thank you, Chair.